Zdravstvuyte, and welcome to episode 7 of my Soviet Union vlog. The last couple of episodes, we looked at Stalin taking power and what that looked like, his power base in the 1920s, and then last time looking at the purges and the terror of 1930s. And in this one, we're going to think about Stalin's government and how he ran the Soviet Union, and particularly kind of how his power became very personalized. So, as we know, by 1928, Stalin was the sole leader of the Soviet Union, and he was in a position to start consolidating his grip on power. By the end of 1930, he was the only member of the Politburo remaining from 1924, the only full member of the Politburo remaining from 1924. Molotov and Kalinin, I think, had been candidate members. Opponents, real and imagined, had been replaced by supporters like Molotov, Voroshilov, Kalinin, and Kaganovich. And all this meant that Stalin was able to have a Politburo that agreed with his policies and was able to have them meet less often through the 30s. So in 1932, 43 times the Politburo met, but by 1938, they were only meeting about 4 times. Well, they only met 4 times in 1938. However, although Stalin had taken power in 1928, he's not immediately in complete control. And we've got several examples of that. For instance, in 1932, he wanted to execute Ryutin because Ryutin had denounced him for building a personal dictatorship, ironically. But the Politburo refused to have Ryutin executed, and instead he's given a mere 10 years in a labour camp, which is still bad enough, but clearly it shows that Stalin's not able to execute his full will. And also in 1932, Stalin's targets for the second 5-year plan were considered too ambitious by people both inside and outside the party, and he's forced to accept a redrafting of those targets, a reducing of them. There are several individuals who also, to a greater or lesser extent, challenged that idea of Stalin as an immediate totalitarian dictator from the early 1930s. The best one of these is Sergei Kirov, the genuinely popular leader of the party in Leningrad, fellow member of the Politburo, more of a moderate within the leadership, and he scored more votes in elections to the Central Committee in 1934, famously, and then was murdered not too long afterwards, either kind of on Stalin's orders or conveniently for Stalin, triggering what became the Great Terror into the 1930s. 2 other less kind of enthusiastic opponents, but nevertheless people who showed they weren't just kind of yes men for Stalin, were Kuibyshev, probably, and the head of Gosplan. I'll spell these for you: Kuibyshev. He might have expressed concerns, but he died of a heart attack in 1935. And Ordzonikidze, the Commissar for Heavy Industry, and that's spelled Ordzonikidze. He's actually an ally of Stalin and quite a close someone who worked very closely with him. But even he raised objections to terror in the sort of mid-30s. Stalin arrested his deputy and had him shot. And that seems to eventually have kind of cracked Ordzonikidze, who was officially, it was said that he died of a heart attack in 1937, but it's widely suspected that he took his own life. There were other doubters that were less vocal, understandably, people like Voroshilov and Kalinin, but they became more isolated in the Politburo. Litvinov, the foreign minister, was also someone who famously was very concerned that he'd be arrested in the terror and used to stay up until like 2 or 3 in the morning, fully clothed, playing cards because he didn't want to get arrested in his pajamas. So really, it is in the mid to late 30s that Stalin establishes this kind of full control, and it's as a result of the terror. Lenin had allowed some measure of debate at the top of the party. He'd worked with people like Bukharin and Trotsky, who opposed him publicly upon various policies. But Stalin, literally terrorized the Communist Party. This brings an end to what can be thought of as party rule and establishes more the personal rule of Stalin. This is often called totalitarianism. It seems kind of a new brand of dictatorship in the 1930s based upon the complete control of the economy and the media, the use of extensive propaganda and widespread political terror by an individual who is therefore in total command of the government, the state, and therefore the country. At a personal level, Stalin instituted this by being very intimidating in meetings. He used to walk around the room while others spoke. He wore very soft-soled shoes so they couldn't even hear where he was. There's a real fear in those meetings that saying something disagreeable to Stalin would lead to execution. Good example of that is Pavel Rychagov, the commander of the Soviet Air Force, who was executed after complaining about the quality of aircraft, something that commander of the Soviet Air Force ought to be able to do. Stalin's dictatorship has also been seen as having different aims than previous dictatorships. So it's a totalitarian both in the way that it's structured, but also in its it has a kind of different feel to it. Dictators like the Tsar had been content to run the country and they didn't really care what people felt about them. But Stalin is looking for the commitment and the enthusiasm from his people, at least outwardly, an endorsement of his rule, as it were. How did he do this on a kind of political level? Well, firstly, by exploiting the relationship between party and state. Although Lenin had created both the Communist Party and the Soviet state, he had failed to define their relationship between them. And Stalin used that vagueness of the party-state relationship to encourage competition between them. And therefore, he kind of straddled both and became the arbiter of disagreement. Also within that, he promoted rivals to similar positions in the party and the state. Good example of this is Andrei Zhdanov, who was appointed to be party supervisor of Sergei Berya's political police force. And Zhdanov was a key rival of Beria. So by promoting rivals to similar positions where they're overseeing each other and competing with each other, Stalin again can be the person who firstly stands above the competition and so isn't sucked into it, and then also becomes again the arbiter of that competition, the judge of that competition. Stalin also shifted power from the party towards the state. In 1938, the Politburo was the most senior committee in government, but by 1942, the state, this is a result really of an impact of the Great Patriotic War, by 1942, the State Defence Committee was the most powerful committee in government. And after the war, what had been Sovnarkom becomes renamed the Council of Ministers. That also continues this path of the state institutions being the most powerful. By shifting the centre of power within government like this, Stalin again is able to ensure that none of these committees can either grow to rival him or can grow an individual to rival him who dominates that committee. Stalin ensures that he's the only person involved with all of these top committees, and therefore he's the only one with an overview of the entire government. Having said all that, there were even occasions by the end of the 30s where Stalin could be pressurized, and this happens more from below, that the mass of the country or the party pressures Stalin into acting in particular ways. Good examples of this are over collectivization. There's a groundswell of opinion amongst party activists in the early 30s about the economic power of kulaks and how they need to be dealt with, and that leads to dekulakization in the collectivization process. Industrialization, likewise, Stalin is responding in part to the wishes of the ideological rank and file to bring about rapid industrialization. And within that, perhaps the dizzy with success incident in 1930, where Stalin has to issue a statement criticizing party members for being overzealous in implementing collectivization and calling it a temporary halt to it because they are embracing things like too much, they're pushing too far. Stalin has to try and put the brakes on. Likewise, the purges are not solely driven from above. They expand and accelerate in part due to popular participation. Many colleagues, neighbours, family members denounced victims. A great example of this is in 1932, Pavlik Morozov denouncing his own father and becoming a martyr to the cause. And it's also fair to say that there was conflict between local party members and regional authorities, and local level terror and purging gets out of hand in some places and is certainly outside of the direct control of Stalin and the central powers. And so you could easily argue there that Stalin found it difficult to exercise control even in the mid-30s. Talking of the way that Stalin ran the country, this is a good point perhaps to pause and just think about the Soviet Constitution of 1936. This is the second constitution of the Soviet Union. The first one had been in the 20s. This one, on the face of it, was extremely democratic. In fact, Stalin said that the constitution of the Soviet Union is the only thoroughly democratic constitution in the world. It gave every citizen the vote. And this was a significant change. Before 1936, kulaks and priests had been denied the vote. But since they no longer existed, according to the constitution at least, there was no reason to deny anyone the vote. And the constitution also guaranteed civil rights, such as freedom of the press and freedom of religion, as well as employment, a guaranteed employment, in direct contrast with many capitalist countries in the, well, always, but particularly this is stark in the 1930s when there was a global depression that affected the Western liberal democracies really quite severely. However, although this constitution looked really democratic and even liberal in places, in practice it was a fraud. The constitution explicitly listed a number of restrictions on the rights of citizens, and most importantly, in terms of democracy, it made clear that nothing could threaten the dominance of the Communist Party. Democracy was imposed from above, and it was limited by the party leadership. For example, only candidates from Communist Party were allowed to stand in elections. And in fact, they claimed that political parties were the result of class conflict generated by capitalism. And since capitalism and therefore class conflict did no longer existed in the Soviet Union, they didn't even need more than one political party. It's likely that the 1936 constitution was in part, at least, window dressing, a kind of propaganda exercise to promote the Soviet Union internationally. There'd been some damage to the international reputation as a result of the purges, even though only limited information had leaked out as a result of that, but also to convince Britain and France that the Soviet Union could be a good ally in the potential fight against Nazi Germany. Now, that didn't really help in the initial, the late 1930s, and Stalin was left having to create an alliance with Nazi Germany in 1939. And that lasts till 1941, when, during those 2 years, 1939-41, the Soviet Union was neutral but supplied materials to the Nazis. However, on the 22nd of June 1941, the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, and thereafter, the Soviet Union allied with Britain and America, forming the Grand Alliance against Nazi Germany and fascist Italy and Japan as well in the East. However, initially, the Nazi invasion is almost a disaster for Stalin. He was completely convinced that it wasn't coming, and seems to have suffered a bit of a breakdown and retreated to his country villa for several days, leaving complete confusion in the hierarchy of politics within the Soviet Union. Eventually, Molotov coaxes him. It seems like maybe he expected to be killed by the Politburo, that they're shot as he would have done to anyone else. But Molotov convinces him, no, we need you. Come on, come out and help us. And Stalin actually emerges in the end from the Great Patriotic War as a hero to the Soviet people and the key figure that draws the Soviet Union together against the Nazis in their triumph. Politically, the Second World War led to a change in the relationship between party and state, emphasising Stalin's power, but also more of a shift towards the state being powerful. So from 1928, Stalin had been the most powerful man in the Communist Party, but it's only in 1941 that he takes the chair of Sovnarkom, the most senior state committee in the country. From 1924 to 1930, that had been headed by Alexei Rykov. From 1930 all the way through to 1941, that was headed by Molotov, Sovnarkom, headed by Molotov. This change reflected the need for an efficient government during wartime. Stalin's government in the 30s had been quite inefficient, chaotic in places, hampered by the purging of the state, the party, the military, but now it really needed to be streamlined. So Stalin does that in several ways. He ended mass terror, figuring that actually people could always be shot after the war. During the war, people were given a lot more freedom, and state and party were allowed to work together. He, in fact, he opens the churches. That's how far he goes in terms of trying to rebuild morale. He allowed state power to grow, and there's a shift from government from the party to the state, and state ministers make more decisions rather than party bosses. State ministers perhaps having a little bit more expertise. Some generals, such as Georgy Zhukov and some ex-party officials, were released from labour camps where it's felt that their expertise again would be useful. Stalin also created the State Defence Committee, which is acronymed GKO. The GKO was responsible for economic coordination of military production and defence during the war, and this becomes like a funnel, really, for a lot of policies. And of course, they use mass propaganda. As I said, they open the churches, but they think a lot about the morale of the Soviet people in the Second World War, and appealing to Russian nationalism rather than appealing to socialism. Their aim is to mobilize people to fight for the Soviet Union. And Stalin himself is presented as a symbol of unity. And this is one of the reasons that he comes out of the war so triumphant. After the Second World War, Stalin's rule, of course, is concerned with reconstruction and reasserting the leadership that had been relaxed. There are several examples of terror after the Second World War. The Leningrad affair in 1949 was a purge of the Leningrad Party. Around 100 supporters of Zhdanov were shot after his death, about 2,000 arrested and dismissed. Stalin tested the loyalty of senior ministers, arresting the wife of Molotov and seeing whether he would be more loyal to his wife or more loyal to Stalin. Wisely, Molotov is loyal to Stalin, and both he and his wife survive for a long. Well, he survives Molotov till 1986. The Doctors' Plot in 1953 was the last purge, and actually that was cut short by Stalin's death. This was a purge of doctors who were accused of trying to assassinate leadership, and may have been a prelude to a campaign against Jews, or perhaps a move against Beria. But in those last years, firstly, there's a emergence of younger members in the Politburo, like Andrei Zhdanov, like he dies, Georgy Malenkov, eventually Beria. But Stalin's power is weakening, and this is seen perhaps most obviously in the Party Congress in 1952, where Stalin renames the Politburo the Presidium and enlarges it from 10 members to 36 members, allowing Stalin to bring in new people to try and dilute the influence of Beria and Malenkov. Leonid Brezhnev is brought in, and Nikolai Ignatiev, who have no links to Beria or Malenkov. And this idea of diluting their influence is very important, because it shows that Stalin no longer had the authority or power to sack them and remove them. So I've talked for a long time there. In fact, this is the longest vlog I've ever done. And really, what I want to see here is that Stalin's government is based around him as a person. He establishes a single ideological orthodoxy in a way that Lenin hadn't done. Lenin was a commanding figure of authority, but he did allow debate and ideas to be expressed around him. Stalin chooses instead to rule out of fear, figuring that fear will bring about loyalty, rather than people being loyal to communism or socialism in and of itself. As a result, Stalin becomes the personal ruler of the Soviet Union, and by the time of his death, his heirs are in the position now of having to revive the party or the state and to compete in which one they're going to be powerful, rather than being able to step straight into a position of authority. I hope that's helpful. Sorry so long. I'll see you next time.